I wonder, have you ever tried pottery? There's a bit of a creative bunch here. Has anyone ever tried pottery before? Jim, Heather, love it. We have a couple of people. I have watched, I don't know if you've seen it on TV, the Great British Throwdown. I think it had been on Channel 4 for a while. We're a bit behind. But it mesmerised me. They would put this lump of clay onto a wheel, they'd spin it around, and suddenly they would have a vase or a whatever. Well, let me show you. I got to go and do some pottery, and I made this. I know, it's really impressive, isn't it? Now, I'm not quite sure what it is, because it feels too small to be a bowl or a cup. It would be a very small plant pot, but the thing is, I made it. So no matter what, it'll probably be one of them things that gathers bits. You know, we all have one of those pots. But I made this, and it's so special because I put time and energy and effort into it. You can have a wee look at the end. It's not perfect. There's lumpy bits. Inside it's a bit rigidy, which I'm told is not a design feature, and it's not meant to do that. But there's something so exciting about being able to hold the clay and to use it and to move it around in my hands. And when I was making that clay pot, as we'll call it, there was something just really exciting about the process. Like, there's an instructor there, and he's telling me, go slower. And I'm thinking, but the wheel is spinning round. How am I meant to go slower? I'm meant to try and keep, and you have to very slowly move your hands up. And it's very delicate, because if you put your finger or your thumb through it, it just all goes a bit flat. So it's a slow process, which I wasn't prepared for, because I'm not a very patient person, and I'm not very good at taking things slow. So I had to learn, even making that pot, just to slow down a little bit. But I really enjoyed it, and so I went back again. I haven't picked that pot up yet, so I had no idea what it'll look like. But even in the time, it had been a couple of months in between, and I came back and I'd forgotten how slow you have to go. I'd forgotten the little techniques of where you put your fingers and where you put your thumbs. And as I was reflecting on those two experiences, and I came to this passage in Jeremiah, I was thinking about the process and how God made each of us, how God created us. There was a process and a plan. And if we look at creation, we see God's process and plan for us. It might seem a bit slow. Why didn't he just make humans first? Well, we needed everything else to be in place. God had a plan. He knew what he was doing. And when we look at this passage that Heather read to us from Jeremiah, we see Jeremiah as an Israelite priest. And he's living and working at a time, and God brings this message, and he says, Jeremiah, I want you to be my messenger. I want you to be the prophet that speaks these words to the people around you. And you might think, that's great, I'd love to be a messenger for God. But God's message was a little bit doom and gloom. It's not quite what they were expecting. God's message was, you have sinned. You need to repent and come back to me. You need to stop worshipping all those other gods and all those idols that you've built for yourself. And if you don't, then there will be consequences for your choices. What a big, scary message for Jeremiah to take to the people. But if we flick right back to the start of Jeremiah, God says these words to him. He says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, you were set apart, and I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And this reminds us that God knows each of us intimately. He knows each of us from before we're even born. Like that Psalm 139 reminds us, God has plans and has created us. So the whole of Jeremiah 1 gives us this image of God calling Jeremiah to a great big task. But he's calling him to this task, and he says, I promise I'll be with you. And I promise I will protect you and strengthen you for the task. So the people might have seen Jeremiah as this doom and gloom messenger. But actually, he was bringing a message of restoration, a message of hope. He was saying, if you turn from the evil of idolatry, if you turn back to God, look at this beautiful relationship, this covenant relationship we can have with God. So he comes and he brings a message, not just of doom and gloom, but of restoration and hope. Because God said this of Jeremiah, I've appointed you over the nations and the kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And again, I'm not very good with my hands, but when you uproot something and you tear it down, that seems very negative. When you destroy something and you overthrow it, you might think that's not very good. But what about building and planting? Those are good things. And so God has to make a change for something good to happen. God might have to destroy and overthrow in order for things to be built and planted. And we see this passage before the people were in exile, before God had moved them to the next chapter. We see him use this analogy of a potter and the clay. And in this, we are meant to be the clay and God is the potter, because potter in Hebrew actually means maker. And so when we think of God, our great maker, we think of us as the clay in his hands. And there's a couple of things that this passage reminds me. It reminds me that God is sovereign. God is in control of all things. It reminds me that God is faithful to his promise to protect and strengthen. And it encourages me because God wants to use us. We are the clay. And so at the start of the passage, we hear that the clay is marred. The clay is ruined. The potter is shaping something from the clay, but it's ruined. And so you might think, oh, we'll just get rid of that clay. If it's bad clay, just put it in the bin, just get rid of it. Or maybe you're not a very good potter because you can't, that whole a bad workman blames his tools. Maybe you're just not a good potter. Maybe you're not very good at using what you've got. But if God is the maker, the potter, then he is very good at using what he's got. It's not his skills that are at question, because all have sinned and fallen short. And yet Jesus came to die for each one of us. And so the clay isn't perfect. We aren't perfect. But this little verse in the middle stands out. The clay was shaped as the potter seemed best to him. The clay was shaped as the potter seemed best to him. We are shaped as God sees best for us. Best for us in the situations that we're in here and now. God continues to shape us because we continue to be marred. We continue to be fallen and broken people. But God continues to shape us and use us for his kingdom and his glory. And like I said earlier, making the clay pot was a slow process. It was difficult at times. It was frustrating for me, the maker, but how beautiful to see what I have created turn out. God's shaping of us might seem slow and painful. We might not be able to see the plan ahead, but God, our potter, our maker, is working it all out for our good. So although we are marred, God is still in control and still wants to use us. The second thing, the potter did have control of the clay. The potter had control of the individual use of the clay. No pieces of pottery, no matter how expert the person is, can create two things the same. Each one of us is unique. And God said, can I not do with Israel as the potter does? Can I not reshape a nation? Not just one individual. Can I not change the whole atmosphere of a nation? And so this is where I'm reminded this is a message of hope and restoration, not doom and gloom. Because it all depends on the perspective of which you look at it. You might see God as in control, as a child with a magnifying glass over an anthill. But that's not the God I see. I don't see a God that brings that destruction. I see a God that wants to bring us the beauty, wants to bring us to the goodness that we deserve. And so God says to them, those idols you're worshipping, they're not good. Don't do that. Rather, worship me, the true living God. And sometimes we like to take the control into our own hands. Maybe we don't worship idols in the same way as the Israelites would have done. But there are different things that take our attention off God. And God allows us to choose and to have free will. But he also wants to be sovereign in our lives. He wants to be in control. He wants us to choose and follow his ways. But we can be a bit stubborn. I can be a bit stubborn. And so God continues the whole way throughout the Old Testament to call the people back to him. And he keeps sending prophets until they get the point. And unfortunately they don't. It's just this spiral of sin. And every time a messenger comes to tell them of this true way of life, they might follow it for a while, or they might say, go away and leave us alone. We're happy worshipping our gods. And it goes round and round and round until Jesus comes, the final messenger from God, the messenger that brings the joy of new life in so many ways. And so sometimes when we can not follow God's ways, we can forget of the greatness of Jesus' coming. We forget that it's been part of a plan since the very beginning. And so today we get this opportunity to celebrate communion, to celebrate Jesus' coming for each one of us. And as I think of Psalm 139 and Jeremiah 18, it makes me more excited to celebrate communion with God because God knows me. God knows me deeply. He loves me. He wants to shape me and use me. And so today we have this opportunity to respond to God's grace, to say, yes, God, more of you in my life. God said at the start of Jeremiah, my people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that can't hold water. I just love all the imagery of Jeremiah. A broken cistern that can't hold water. Instead, come to me, the spring of living water. And so this morning, communion can be that spring of living water for each one of us, that we might come and be with God and receive afresh his strength and sustenance for whatever life is going to throw at us. How might God be wanting to shape and use you this week? How willing are we to be the clay in God's hands? How willing are we to go a part of the slow and at times painful process, but that God would be removing all the cracks and all the ridges and all the faults in us, that he might shape us and use us for his kingdom?